fountain free, 'tis for you and me. Let us taste the haste to its free. 'Tis a fountain of love from the source above, and He bids us all freely drink. Will you come to the fountain free? Will you come? 'Tis for you
It's good to see y'all tonight. Here we are, the Wednesday before Christmas. Hope y'all are ready. We are not. I mean, I think we are, but every time I think we are, something else pops up. But we're doing all right. Hope y'all are doing well. Hope you've had a good week so far. We're at the midweek point. So tonight, what we're going to do is we'll be in Mark, and specifically, we're going to go back to Mark chapter 5. So if you want to open up to Mark 5 in your Bibles, Mark chapter 5. Now, I have gotten some feedback. Two people. So, two people have given me feedback on Wednesday nights on what they would like to do, and so far the vote that I've received is to maybe do kind of a dive into the Psalms of Lament and really thinking about what those mean and what those are, and discussing them further. And you think about it, we probably don't discuss those very frequently. There's a handful of psalms that we all know at least parts of, or once someone starts it, we might could finish it. There's several that are familiar to us, but this would dive into others that maybe aren't as familiar, and that I think would be a blessing for us to study. And so that's our plan as of right now. The feedback I've received is to go that route, so I think we might go that route, unless I hear some, a wide chaos of difference there, a wide range of difference that you want to study something else. That's kind of the plan. So I want to, thank the two people that actually spoke up, and the rest of you, come on. No, I'm just kidding. I know a lot of times you don't have a preference, and that's fine, but I always, before I jump into a class that's going to be a series of lessons, I always like to at least give a chance for input, so that if there's something you'd like to talk about, chances are if it's on your mind, it's probably on at least one or two other people's in this class as well. So it's a good idea. There are no silly suggestions. So that's kind of where we're going to be as of right now. So with that being said, remember the handouts for Sunday nights. I'm going to leave them out in the lobbies for at least a week or two after that night, so that if you didn't get it Sunday night, you can pick it up the next Sunday. You can pick it up that Wednesday, whatever you need to do for your binders. If you've not gotten a binder yet, I have extras in my office, so just let me know after class, and I can get you a binder. We have plenty. So, like I told you before, you don't have to share unless you just want to. All right. With all that being said, tonight, what we're going to look at in chapter 5 of Mark is learning from Jesus. When we learn from Jesus here, we find the secret to thinking and feeling like Jesus thought and felt when he was on this earth. And we do that by examining some stories here. And I say stories, just remember these are actual events. They're not fictional, they're real. Real events in history that happened. So we have some moments here that happen in the life of Jesus where we see how he thought and how he felt. And we can learn from that because if we're trying to be Christ-like, that obviously connects to how we think and how we feel. So with that being said, if you think about the physical heart for just a moment, when you think of the size of the physical heart, it's only about half a pound. It's only about the size of a human fist. It's the strongest muscle of the whole body. It's what is called an involuntary muscle, and that means you don't have to think for it to act, right? You don't think about it, your heart just beats, your heart just pumps, right? So you have to think for the muscles in your thumbs and your fingers. You're not just sitting there and all of a sudden your fingers just move around. Not normal, right? And so you don't have to think about the heart. It does what it's supposed to do. Some other muscles, obviously, in our body, they're not involuntary. You actually have to move them. And so you think about your thumb and your finger when you're going to pick up a pencil, for example, and how they would function to pick up a pencil. But with the function of the heart, it just functions all the time without you having to think about it. Therefore, involuntary muscle. It beats about 100,000 times a day, roughly. I'm not a doctor, so don't quote me on that, but that's kind of what I can gather. It beats about 100,000 times a day. Now, for a second, think about the spiritual heart. The Bible often uses the word heart in reference to the spiritual side of man, right? Can you think of any verses in the Bible? You don't have to give me book, chapter, and verse, but just anything that comes to your mind about when the Bible references the heart in a spiritual sense. Not everybody at once. Okay, Proverbs 3, 5 through 6. Trust in the Lord with all your heart, lean not on your own understanding. In all your ways acknowledge Him, and He shall direct your paths. The next chapter, Proverbs 4, verse 23. Keep your heart with all diligence, for out of it spring the issues of life. There's an example. The way we think, the way that we process, the way that we react is really the seed of who we really are. And doesn't the Bible say that? It's not what one puts into their mouth that defiles them, but it's what comes out of the mouth, because what comes out of means it's taken place deeper. It's not just a surface thing, it's deeper. So there's a problem there. So when the bad things are coming out, it's not the stuff you've put in the mouth. That's showing who you really are. That's why it says that defiles you. It's actions that give a picture of this is who you are. And that's why it's so important that we're careful about what we put into our hearts. That's why we tell our kids the garbage in and garbage out, and that's why we talk about those kinds of things, And like I've talked about before, when you think of if you have like a coffee mug and you put coffee in it, and you're walking and someone bumps into you, well, what comes out of that cup, that mug, is going to be coffee, right? It wouldn't be Coke or Pepsi. In McMinnville, it might be Sundrop, because we treat it like it's the nectar of the gods, right? The Sundrop is the special stuff. But whatever you put in the mug is what comes out if someone were to bump into you. And that's kind of what we think of in our lives. Whatever we're putting into us is what's going to come out when we're bumped into in life. Not necessarily literally, but when life bumps into us, knocks us down, all that kind of stuff, whatever's been put in is what comes out. And so it's so important that we maintain the heart. As we think about the seed of who we are, right? There are basically three components to that. First, there is this intellectual component, right? As a man thinks in his heart, so is he. Thinks, intellectual, right? So there's the intellectual component. There is also the emotional component. 1 Peter 1:22, love one another with a pure heart. Starts with F, ends with fervently. Love one another with a pure heart fervently. So you see the thinking part, the intellectual part. Then you see loving one another. There's the emotional component of who we really are. Then there's the volitional component. Now, volition, that's making choices, or the freedom of choice, basically, is what we mean by that. Thus, we make decisions with our spiritual hearts. If you want to flip over to Romans 6, just very briefly here, before we come back to our main text, in Romans 6, in verse 17, says, "But God be thanked that though you were slaves of sin, yet you obeyed from the heart that form of doctrine to which you were delivered." They chose obedience. There was a choice. Yes, God could make all of us robots, but He gives every one of us the freedom to choose. And so when you say, well, God surely would not punish this person, or God loves, and so since God is love, why would He do this to someone? The reality is, we, as we know, and as the Bible tells us, we reap what we sow. And so if our choices are to reject God's offer and God's gifts of salvation and freedom from sin and forgiveness, that's our choice. So whatever we get from that is what we have chosen, right? So you look at it, isn't it so much better when someone chooses to love you and to be kind to you, right? Not because you've made them. And so God wants us to choose Him. He gives us that freedom. So there's the volitional component of who we are, and that is our freedom to make our own choices. It's from this seed of who we are that we think, that we feel, and that we make our decisions resulting in how we act in our lives. So tonight, what we're going to do is we're focusing on thinking like Jesus, on feeling like Jesus, and reaching a point to where we make decisions based on how Jesus made decisions. You know, people used to wear those bracelets. You might still have them. WWJD. What would Jesus do? Meant to cause you to stop and think before you made decisions, before you talked, before you told that joke, before you did this, before you did that, you know. So I remember when I was in school and all the kids would wear those. It was a big thing to wear them. Well, it's a good idea to be reminded of what would Jesus do here? How would Jesus treat that person? What would Jesus say? And so that's really what we're wanting to think about tonight. In Matthew 11 and 29, verse 29, Jesus says, "Take my yoke upon you and" what? "Learn from me." Now remember, in those days with the oxen, typically you would have an older, more mature ox that would be yoked together with a younger, more immature ox that didn't really know that much. And the reason is the younger one would be, since they're both in that yoke together, they're yoked together, the older one would pull and teach the younger one what to do. And it would lead. And so the idea of being yoked to Jesus is we're letting Him lead and show us. We're learning from Him. That's that idea in Matthew 11 and verse 29. To stop and yoke ourselves together with Jesus, so where He goes, I'm going. And what He's doing, I'm doing. And I'm learning how to live a life that honors God. That's that idea in Matthew 11. So that's what we're thinking about tonight. Philippians 2, verse 5. What did Paul say? "Have this mind in you, which was also in Christ Jesus." And so we're wanting to have that mind of Christ. We're going to get a little insight into how Jesus thought and felt and what motivated Him to make the decisions that He made. So, here we go. Mark 5, verse 21 beginning. First, Jesus is interacting with a particular man, okay? So verse 21, "Now when Jesus had crossed over again by boat to the other side, a great multitude gathered to Him. And He was by the sea. And behold, one of the rulers of the synagogue came, Jairus by name. And when he saw Him, he fell at His feet and begged Him earnestly, saying, 'My little daughter lies at the point of death. Come and lay your hands on her, that she may be healed, and she will live.' So Jesus went with him, and a great multitude followed Him and thronged Him." So there is Jesus initially acting with this particular man named Jairus. We learn that he is a ruler of the synagogue, so he's a man of importance. He has a name, right? We know his name. We're told his name. But right before, as he's going to help this man, this ruler of the synagogue, there's kind of this interruption that happens with this lady. And this is in verse, of course, picking up verse 25, says, "Now a certain woman," you can continue in verse 24. This is important to remember. "Jesus went with Him, and a great multitude followed Him and thronged Him." Keep that in mind. "Now a certain woman," verse 25, "had a flow of blood for 12 years, and had suffered many things from many physicians." So in other words, she had gone to see a lot of doctors about her issue, and it just made things worse. She now is suffering more than initially after having all these treatments and these trials of things to try to figure out how to fix it. By seeing the doctor, she's worse off, right? So none of us could ever see that happening, right? Okay, I'll leave that there. So verse 24 or verse 25, verse 27 now. "When she heard about Jesus, she came behind Him in the crowd and touched His garment. For she said, 'If only I may touch His clothes, I shall be made well.' Immediately the fountain of her blood was dried up, and she felt in her body that she was healed of the affliction. And Jesus, immediately knowing in Himself that power had gone out of Him, turned around in the crowd and said, 'Who touched my clothes?' And I always laugh at this in a sense, because in verse 31, "But His disciples said to Him, 'You see the multitude thronging you, and you say, "Who touched me?'" In other words, what are they saying? Pick. who didn't touch you. Everybody, they're all around you, Jesus. They're bumping into you. They're touching you. They want to touch you. So they were kind of like, what do you mean? There's a lot of people that touched you. But Jesus didn't. He meant something very specific, obviously. He's referencing this woman that went up behind him and touched him. Okay, let's continue verse 31. Verse 32, he looked around to see her who had done this thing, but the woman, fearing and trembling, knowing what had happened to her, came and fell down before him and told him the whole truth. And he said to her, "Daughter, your faith has made you well. Go in peace and be healed of your affliction." Now, we know nothing about this woman except that she's a woman who has a medical issue with this flow of blood for 12 years. Now, when you think about it, Jairus' daughter was how old? 12. As long as this little girl had been alive, this poor woman had been dealing with this issue. And so we don't know her name. We don't know her occupation or if she had one. We know her disease, her issue that she's having. And we know that she knew, if I could just touch Jesus, then I'd be healed. And we know that she's in a lot worse shape than initially when she was having the issues. That's all we know about her. So it's interesting when you look at the two because they're very different. You have a man, and in that culture, they would be viewed a certain way. We know his name. He was a ruler in the synagogue. We have a woman. She has a name. We just aren't told her name. And because of her issue, people wouldn't want to be around her. They wouldn't go near her. If she sat somewhere, they wouldn't go near where she sat. They'd be afraid of getting whatever she had. And so she's treated, in a sense, like a leper. We've talked about that before. And so Jesus gives his attention to Jairus. He takes a moment to give his attention to this woman that we don't know her name, and she's in obviously a completely different status of society versus what this man is, yet Jesus gives both of them his attention. Let's continue, and Jesus is going to pick up interacting with the man again. So, verse 35. While he was still speaking, some came from the ruler of the synagogue's house and who said, "Your daughter is dead. Why trouble the teacher any further?" Don't bother with Jesus. The daughter is dead. So as soon as Jesus heard the word that was spoken, he said to the ruler of the synagogue, "Do not be afraid, only believe." And he permitted no one to follow him except Peter, James, and John, the brother of James. Then he came to the house of the ruler of the synagogue, and he saw a tumult and those who wept and wailed loudly. When he came in, he said to them, "Why make this commotion and weep? The child is not dead, but sleeping." And they ridiculed him. But when he had put them all outside, he took the father and the mother of the child and those who were with him and entered where the child was lying. Then he took the child by the hand and said to her, "Talitha cumi," which is translated, "Little girl, I say to you, arise." Immediately the girl arose and walked, for she was 12 years of age, and they were overcome with great amazement. But he commanded them strictly that no one should know it, and said that something should be given her to eat. Now, what do we learn about Jesus? What do we learn from him? First, what do we learn about him? You ever seen a three-legged stool? It's not a trick question. They're real, right? You've seen them. What happens if you take just one of those legs away? It ain't going to function. It's going to fall. It's not going to be a stool that you can sit on and trust, right? When we look at the heart of Jesus, we see three things that make up the heart of Jesus. And all three are vital when it comes to the heart of Jesus. Now, the three things relative to the way that Jesus thought, felt, and made decisions. First, you see this in all through his ministry, but we especially see it here too. He was impartial. He was impartial. There is a contrast made in our text between these two individuals that Jesus is helping. There is this daddy, this father, and his name is Jairus. Then there's this woman who is struggling with her health. There are some striking contrasts made. We already kind of mentioned them. One, he's a male and she's a female. There's one contrast. Now, why is that significant? In Bible times, those two genders were miles apart when it came to social connection and importance. In their culture, the view of women was less than it needed to be. It was less than it should have been. They were possessions rather than equals a lot of times. In Jesus, there is neither male nor female, right? They are of equal importance to him. Now, that doesn't mean they don't serve in different capacities, that there aren't different roles and different functions. It just means that when it comes to their souls, they're equally important to Jesus. So we know that. We know not only is it a man and a woman, but the man is named, the woman remains unnamed. Now, it's not uncommon to have individuals who are unnamed in accounts of the Bible, but in this setting, the contrast sticks out, since Jesus is helping two specific individuals. Jairus, the third thing, Jairus is described as one of the rulers of the synagogue in verse 22 of our text. Synagogue, remember, means meeting place. Two words that together mean the going together place, the coming together place. It's in this getting together place where you would see individuals who would take the lead. And there would be an elevated place, and in that elevated place there'd be a chair that was sitting down, and this would be the seat of Moses. And it was called that because people would come and sit in the seat of Moses, and can you guess what they would do? Read the law. They would come, they would sit there in that chair, and they would read the law. And you would have differing lengths of reading, always sequentially through the Bible each and every day. There would be a more lengthy reading on the day of the Sabbath, and then a more lengthy reading and special readings on feast days. So who was to do the readings? The ruler of the synagogue took that responsibility. So Jairus was an individual who had some major responsibility in the going together place of the Jews in this particular city. He was a ruler, but this woman was actually, as far as the record is concerned, and speaking with respect, a nobody. So he's a ruler of a synagogue, and she would be kind of a nobody. We don't know one thing about her life, her background, except, outside of the fact that she was sick and had spent all of her money trying to get well. We have one person who was in charge of the practices in the synagogue, and one who is considered ritually unclean and couldn't participate in assemblies in a synagogue. Her condition would make it impossible for her to be able to go and participate in the synagogue. Jairus comes confidently as a ruler of the synagogue, and the woman, what does she do? Sneaks up behind Jesus just to try to reach out and touch the hem of his garment. To whom did Jesus give his attention? Not a trick question. Jairus or the woman, who did Jesus give his attention to? Yes, both of them, right? They both got his attention. He did not give one more attention than he gave the other. He gave equal attention to both. Point of fact, in verse 24, it says that Jesus went with him. Those words carry the idea of Jesus going away from the crowd with Jairus. It's as if Jesus is kind of changing his plans in this moment to help this man and his daughter and his family. But in the midst of the people, the woman touches him, and he turns around and he gives her attention. And verse 21 says, a great crowd gathers around him, and amidst this great crowd, he gives attention to this one man, Jairus. So now Jairus and Jesus are making their way to Jairus' house, to where his daughter is. And the great crowd is on the move, and he pauses, and he gives his attention to one person again in the crowd. So in the crowd, he gives his attention to one, and amidst the crowd, he gives his attention to one. He gives his attention equally to both of these individuals, despite all of the contrast that we would see from the text and that people in that culture, that town, that place would see. Jesus was impartial. That's one of the legs of that stool of who Jesus is. What a wonderful thought, that Jesus is impartial. Not just impartial, but Jesus was also helpful. He wanted to be helpful. Think about the attention he was willing to give Jairus. He came and fell at his feet. Jairus did. Now, in Matthew's account, that's what it says. Proskuneo is used. Okay? Now, what does that word mean? Do you remember proskuneo? It sounds weird and fancy, and you probably haven't used it this week. But it's a word we typically talk about when it comes to worship. To prostrate oneself before, to blow a kiss towards. The idea of worship here. Okay? So it's given the idea that Jairus falls down at Jesus' feet, worshiping Jesus, begging for his help. And so you can hear, it says that he begged him earnestly. He's begging Jesus so much to come and help him. And you can almost imagine, as he says the words, "my little girl." There's something about a father-daughter relationship. I know that I am doomed because of Ella. Like, man, when she, like, even right now, and she knows it all already too. But there's something special about a father-daughter relationship. And this father, this daddy, comes and he says, "my little girl, my daughter." He falls down at the feet of Jesus, begging for his help, worshiping him. The girl is 12 years old, and we would call her today a preteen, but you fathers know she was his little girl. Now, Luke tells us she was his only daughter, if not possibly his only child. And it says she lies at the point of death. Now, interestingly, the word that's used for death here, it's a word that it's eschatos, which eschatology is the study of the last thing. So the idea here, eschatos, is the last. This daddy comes to Jesus, he's begging him, and he's saying, "my little girl, my child, my only child, is at her last. She has not died yet, but she's about to take her last breath." And that's what he's saying here to Jesus. And he's begging for help, and the text says that Jesus went with him. He went with him. I don't know what his plans were before, but he changed his plans because he wanted to be helpful to a daddy. Isn't that wonderful? What about the woman? This woman has been in some difficult times for 12 years, right? And she's consulted every doctor, every physician that she can. And Mark says she's worse now than she was previously. So she spent all of her money, and she's no better off. She's actually worse off. Leviticus 15 and Leviticus 20 reference the impurity and the ritual uncleanness this woman would be dealing with and how she would be viewed. So she's impure in that way, plus the impoverished nature as well of what she's going through. She's spent all of her money on all this stuff trying to get better. There's shame, a shame associated with this in her society. So she's basically treated, like I said, like a leper. There were protocols that you had to follow. Even sharing chairs or being in the vicinity of this unclean person was something they would avoid. Back in those days, socially, it was thought that an individual going through what this woman was going through, you didn't even want her to breathe in your direction. Even her breath was deemed detrimental. For her to look on you was deemed detrimental. You didn't want to walk in her footsteps. Women in various stages of life, month by month, were viewed that way. But this woman had this problem year-round for 12 years. 12 years. Where people would immediately run if they saw you. Where people would look completely away from you if you tried to look at them. Where people would probably say a lot of nasty things about you and to you. Where people wouldn't even want you to breathe in their direction. People wouldn't sit where you sat. They wouldn't walk in your footsteps where you go, where you went. That's what she dealt with for 12 years. We already made this connection, but how old is the little girl? 12. So as long as this little girl has been alive, this woman had dealt with a disease that left her socially ostracized. Not only in public, but even in her own house. Why did it work when she touched the hem of the garment of Jesus? Why was she healed? Because of her faith, right? Great faith. He could have put that problem right back on her, but he wanted to help her. Our Lord wants to help people. You can't think about Jesus without thinking about his desire to be helpful to all people. So one leg of that three-legged stool is his impartiality. Jesus was impartial. Another leg is Jesus wanted to be helpful. The third leg that keeps that stool standing and that we must have if we want to really be like Jesus is he was humble. Verse 43, remember he commanded them strictly that no one should know it and said that something should be given her to eat. We find this often with Jesus. He would heal someone and then he'd tell them to not tell anybody. Why didn't Jesus want this known? Okay? So, I mean, you're going to probably tell anyways, right? And it's hard not to tell that. So why would Jesus say don't tell it? Go with me to Matthew 12 for a moment. Matthew chapter 12. Jesus is referencing the prophet Isaiah here, specifically Isaiah 42. Notice what he says. Verse 18, Matthew chapter 12, verse 18. Behold, my servant whom I have chosen, my beloved in whom my soul is well pleased. I will put my spirit upon him, and he will declare justice to the Gentiles. He will not quarrel nor cry out, nor will anyone hear his voice in the streets. A bruised reed will not break, and smoking flax he will not. A bruised reed he will not break, and smoking flax he will not quench, till he sends forth justice to victory, and in his name Gentiles will trust. Isaiah, hundreds of years before this, before Jesus was even born, predicted that the Messiah would have a humble heart, that he would not proclaim this in the streets. Notice what it said there. Nor will anyone hear his voice in the streets. He was truly a humble man that constantly gave attention to the needs of others. And there would be a time and place where people would hear about Jesus and learn about Jesus and know about Jesus. But Jesus was humble. I mean, can you imagine the ability that Jesus had, yet still maintaining humility? Mm-hmm. Yeah. There's people always following him. You see his popularity in this part of his ministry where he can't get away from people and they're always all around him, and that's exhausting. And Jesus dealt with that all the time. But he, despite that popularity at this time, despite the power that he had as the Son of God, he maintained humility. So when you think of who Jesus is and who he was when he was on this earth, you see he was impartial, you see he was helpful, and you see that he was humble. So if we want to be like Jesus, all three of those legs better describe us. We better be impartial, we better be helpful, and we better be humble. Now, that's what we learn about Jesus, right? We have a little time left here. Let's take this closing amount of time and talk about, this last little bit of time, and talk about what do we learn from him in this passage. Two things, and I'll give you a challenge, and the lesson will be yours tonight. So, first, there should be no difference in the way I see people and the way I treat people. There should be no difference in the way I see people and the way I treat people. Think back to the contrast that we just talked about a moment ago with Jairus and this woman. He did not choose the lofty over the lowly or vice versa. Jesus looked at everyone and saw them in an equal way. Now, can you think of another time when Jesus looked over the prejudice and the partiality that others would show? Okay, the lady at the well, the woman at the well in John chapter 4. She was a Samaritan woman, right? And Jesus, so she had two things against her in terms of a Jew's perspective. She was a woman and she was a Samaritan. And so you've seen the pictures before how the Jews were so opposed to Samaritans that instead of just going in a straight line to get from place to place, they would go around Samaria, because Samaria was in the middle. So they would go around and spend a lot more time traveling just to avoid Samaria and Samaritans. Well, Jesus goes to this well and speaks to a woman who is a Samaritan and who is dealing with this issue of having all these different husbands, right? And remember, Jesus says, who's your husband? And she basically, I don't have a husband. He's like, you've spoken right. You don't, right? And so Jesus speaks to this woman at the well and shows, again, impartiality. James 2, 1 through 13 tells us that being partial towards people is sinful. It's sinful. And the imagery given there is the idea of someone coming in dressed, as we would say, to a T, right? To the T. They're in the finest clothing. They've got the best jewelry, nicest shoes. They might have driven up in a really nice vehicle. And maybe it's a husband and wife, and they've got 2 or 3, 4 kids. And you're like, oh, we really need them here at Central. And then someone else walks in with jeans and holes in them and maybe a T-shirt by themselves. Hair looks maybe moppy or like they've not showered. And we're like, what are they doing here? What's he been into? That's sinful. That's sinful. Now, are there times when someone might look a certain way and what you might think that is how they actually are, if you know what I'm saying? Sure. But does that mean that we immediately prejudge and think like we know why they look the way they look and why they walked in that particular day or this particular... No. We cannot be partial. We must be impartial. Don't make prejudgments based off how someone looks or their past, but try to look at them through the eyes of Jesus and show impartiality. Central is a place open to anyone who would want to follow Jesus. It's not meant for only certain groups of people or certain ages of people or certain demographics. It's meant for anyone who wants to know more about Jesus and wants to serve Jesus. That's who we are. And so when we have visitors, do all of our visitors get the same amount of attention from us? Or do certain ones get more attention based off look, outward appearance, stuff like that? Something that you got to think about. We need to see each other with no difference. Men and women, like we said, have different roles, but they are of equal importance. They are equally important to God, and they must be equally important to us. We need to reach out with our hearts to anybody and to everybody. So the first thing we learn from Jesus is there should be no difference in the way we see people and treat people. We cannot be partial towards people. We must be impartial. The second thing, there should be no indifference on my part in the way I think about and treat people. Now, he says to the woman in verse 34, go in peace. In verse 33, it says she came with what? Fear and trembling. And Jesus says, now go in peace. She was afraid, and like we talked about Sunday, Jesus says, peace. We go into the house of Jairus, and everybody says, his daughter is dead. Don't come here, Jesus. Don't bother the teacher. She's dead. And Jesus says, do not fear. They say dead. Jesus says, not dead. His message was the same to both. Don't be afraid. You're going to be okay. Jesus, on both occasions, had time to address their specific needs. I learned not to be indifferent or apathetic towards the needs of other people. Very quickly here in Ephesians chapter 4. Ephesians chapter 4. Verse 28. Paul says to the church there at Ephesus, let him who stole steal no longer, but rather let him labor, working with his hands, what is good, that he may have something to give him who has need. With Jesus, He's a man that only owned the coat on his shoulders, and that was a gift. The Son of God never had. So if we're going to have his heart, we need to make certain we don't ignore the needs of other people. Don't be indifferent. Because if you want to ask me, and you haven't asked me, but if you did, what's one of the biggest problems the church faces today? There's a lot that we're dealing with, right? But indifference and apathy are hurting the church, and they have been hurting the church. All right, very quickly, here's our challenge. Here's where we're ending. An individual had asked a friend, do you know the two greatest problems in Christendom as a whole and in religion today? And the friend replied, I don't know, and I don't care. And the friend replied to that, you're exactly right. You hit the nail on the head. The two greatest problems in Christendom today is ignorance and indifference. To be like Jesus, we need to be individuals who constantly strive to know who Jesus is and how he lived and not be indifferent. So here's our challenge. This week, think about an opportunity to help another person. Then, when you see that opportunity, say to yourself, I don't know and I don't care, and see how it makes you feel. Then, why not do something about it? Because if we have the heart of Jesus, just to say that or think that should make us feel pretty awful. Because that's not how Jesus thought or acted or lived in his life. And we cannot be that way in ours. 3 pieces to who Jesus is: impartial, helpful, humble. Do any of those describe you? You want to learn from Jesus? Learn to not see and treat people differently, and learn not to be indifferent towards how you see and treat people and the needs of others. Look for people that need help and find a way to help. Don't be indifferent. Don't show partiality. Be impartial. Thank y'all for being here tonight. I really appreciate y'all coming out and being present. Next week we'll continue in our class here. We won't start the Psalms of Lament until the first Wednesday night of January. That's our goal. So thank y'all for being here, and I guess we'll see you again in just a few minutes. Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the Central Church of Christ. We want to thank you for being here tonight. We hope your classes went well and you had a good time in there with fellowship and opportunity to study God's Word. We're thankful that you're here as we kind of come back together to close out tonight. The invitation song is number 939. It will be on the screen as usual, but I know there's some that like to use the songbook, so we want to let you know the number in case you want to do that. So that's number 939. It'll be our invitation song tonight. There's a lot of people right now thinking about and talking about Jesus and his life, and a lot of them are focusing heavily on his birth. And you know, we don't know when he was born, we just know that he was born, and what matters is that he was born. And so it's a great opportunity for us to be thinking and talking about Jesus with those people that are thinking about him and talking about him. So in class tonight, we looked at learning from Jesus from Mark chapter 5, kind of learning to think and feel and act like Jesus. And there are really three characteristics we see at the heart of Jesus, especially in Matthew 5 as he's dealing there with Jairus, the ruler of the synagogue, and then the woman, of course, with his daughter who is about to take her last breath, and he's asking for Jesus, begging Jesus to heal her. And then there's the woman that as he's going with Jairus, that we don't know her name, we just know that she has this issue with blood that she's had for 12 years, and she reaches out and touches the hem of his garment, and so then there's this moment where Jesus gives her attention as well, and she's healed, and then he goes on with Jairus to actually heal his daughter. And in all of that, those stories coming together and those moments coming together, there's some things we see about Jesus that we really see all through his ministry, and it's first of all that he is impartial towards everyone, right? And when you look at what Paul says in Galatians, there's no male or female, there's no slave or free, there's no Jew or Greek. All are one in Jesus. You look at what Jesus says to Zacchaeus in Luke 19:10, that the Son of Man has come to seek and to save the lost, not a particular group of people other than just the lost, which describes all of us, right? So Jesus came for all of us. And in all of this, you look at his ministry, Jesus sat and he ate with sinners and tax collectors, and he spent time with people that others liked, and he spent time with people that others didn't like. And so in all of this, we see Jesus showing impartiality. And you look at other things to go with that. He was not just impartial, but he was helpful. In all that he did, he wanted to help people. And so he took time. He was going with the multitude when Jairus came to him, and he leaves the multitude. Whatever he had planned, he leaves the multitude to go help Jairus. And then when the woman comes up and touches the hem of his garment, he stops what he's doing with Jairus for a moment to help her. He just wanted to help people. So he was impartial, and he wanted to be helpful. And the third thing is, even in all of this, he maintained his humility. And we kind of talked about that like a three-legged stool, right? That if you take one of those legs away, the stool is going to fail, it's going to fall down, it's not going to function. And when you look at the heart of Jesus, those are three things that are all descriptive of who he is, who he was. And when you look at us in our lives, if we want to really be like Jesus, those three legs of that stool, if you will, must be things that describe us. So I want to ask you, in your talking with people and how you treat people and how you act around people, are you truly impartial? Do you make prejudgments based off who you think might deserve your help and who you might think doesn't deserve your help? When you think of people that have needs, do you have a strong desire to want to be helpful? And in all of that, do you make sure that you're not standing there saying, look at me and who I've helped? Are you maintaining your humility? We all want to think and feel like Jesus thought and felt and how he lived. We want to live that way. We can't if we fail to be impartial in how we view and treat people. We can't if we ignore people that need our help and just push it aside and say, someone else will help, I don't have time for it. We can't if we let go of our humility and allow pride to take over. So how are you doing tonight? How are you handling those three attributes, those three qualities? Are they a part of who you are? The good news is, if they're not, or if you've got two of the legs but not the third, remember, that stool's going to fall. You wouldn't want to sit on a two-legged stool that's meant to be three legs. So you need to work on all of those things, right? Tonight, if you're here and you know that you're struggling in those areas, we can work on that. We can pray about that. We can do better together. If you're here and you're not a Christian, there's opportunity for you to become one, to repent of sin in your life, to confess Jesus as the Son of God, and to be baptized for the remission of your sins. If you are a Christian and you're struggling and you need prayers, we can pray together. It's the middle of the week. I know we're tired, but if you're hurting tonight, please don't leave before you come to Jesus and allow Him to help you with whatever it is you're hurting with tonight. If you have a need, please come as we stand and as we sing.
Oh, do not let the word depart, and close not us against the light. For sad not the heart, He saved oh tonight. Oh, why not tonight? Oh, why Please be seated.